In 15 seconds, so. I could dance, but I'm not a very good dancer, so I'll just stand here.
There you go.
Okay, I'm Jim Wilbanks. I'm the director of the Department of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. I'd like to welcome you to the 8th in our series of 10 lectures by the faculty of our department. It is my pleasure today to introduce Professor Sean Kalic, a graduate of Kansas State. You can hiss if you want.
Or cheer, you know, either or.
He is the author of a recently published book by Texas A&M University Press, a press that I'm very proud of as a Texas Aggie, but also a Jayhawk as well. He is a full professor in our department, and he will be talking about detente and arms control. So without further ado, Sean, please.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sean Kalic, and I'll be talking about detente and arms control today, which is an interesting subject in the fact that it starts in kind of the Johnson administration, morphs really and takes hold in the Nixon administration, and then slowly dies in the Carter administration. And despite the fact that we only have about 40 minutes, I have to cover that span of time, plus talk about some arms control too that happens. So a big task for a little bit amount of time. If you have questions as we're talking or as I'm talking, feel free to ask me a question and I can answer it then, or we can wait till the end, either or. I'm comfortable doing both, so, okay? Start with the background here. The detente is typically associated with the Nixon administration, Richard Nixon specifically, and Henry Kissinger, back on my first slide, and then, of course, Leonid Brezhnev. But really, the background starts during the Johnson administration. Both Robert McNamara, who wants to start pushing arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, is in favor of a cooling off of the tensions between the superpowers, as is LBJ because of the problems in Vietnam. One of the issues, though, is that because of the problems in Vietnam, that we actually lack a lot of leverage against the Soviet Union. So there's really no incentive for the Soviet Union to engage the United States in open diplomatic negotiations and to decrease the tension. And you can see on the second bullet right there, right? U.S. power seem to have little influence on the Soviet Union. So the big problem becomes, how do you convince a competitor that it's in their best interest to negotiate with you? Any ideas? It's difficult, absolutely. But again, if you want to do it, how do you do it? And that's the problem that the Johnson administration runs into, is that they really want this Cold War to kind of come to, stay focused, okay. I walked too much, sorry. They want this Cold War to relax a little bit. The spheres of influence are pretty much codified from the early 50s and early 60s. We're in a position now where our strategic nuclear forces are in a range where we can both be comfortable and we can mutually incinerate one another. So there is some common grounds, but again, the problem becomes one of a strategic level, that how do you convince the Soviet Union that it's in their best interest to negotiate when it seems that their position vis-a-vis our position is actually much stronger. And that's the problem that the Johnson administration has, not to mention the fact that if you look at the crisis of 1968, you have the Tet Offensive, which has a profound impact politically on Johnson himself, as are our effort in Vietnam, which Dr. Wilbanks talked about last month. One of the other problems here is that Johnson isn't going to stand for re-election, which is a problem. Again, why would they negotiate with a president who is not going to be around in another few months, after all? You have the Czech crisis, which is a problem in the fact that you're going to negotiate with an institution that rolls Polish tanks into downtown Prague and crushes a student rebellion and a rogue government. So do you want to be seen on the world stage as a government that kowtows to folks that are going to crush students and demonstrate them? And again, the pictures on top are actually armored units moving into downtown Prague. The one on the lower left is actually a memorial which is placed at the foot of one of the monuments in downtown Prague. I took that about 2 years ago when I was in Prague. So again, do you want to be part of that? How do you separate yourself from, this is your peer competitor and you want to negotiate with him? There's a problem there, okay? And then last but not least, you have the Martin Luther King RFK assassinations, which are domestic political problems as well. And then last but not least, you have Brezhnev, who's the general secretary of the Communist Party, and not so much of a nice guy, by the way. Not quite Stalin, but not quite, happy-go-lucky guy either. Brezhnev in '68 announces the Brezhnev Doctrine, which is, anybody know what the Brezhnev Doctrine is, by the way? No? I'm not going to get much participation out of you today, am I? Have some more cookies. The Brezhnev Doctrine is essentially the Soviet Union coming out and saying that we reserve the right to essentially support and participate in revolutions around the world. So we can stick our fingers into Latin America, Africa, Asia, in those countries that want to maybe go communist and need a little bit of help. So again, the problem for the Johnson administration becomes you're going to start negotiating with an enemy that has some problems here. Prague Spring and the Brezhnev Doctrine. They're not sitting tight saying, okay, we recognize mutual spheres of influence now. You stay in your half, we'll stay in our half, and we'll just kind of sit back and watch one another. The problem is that with the Brezhnev Doctrine, the Soviets are actively going out looking for rolling back U.S. Western expansion. So again, the question becomes, how do you convince the Soviet Union that it's in their best interest to negotiate with you when it seems, again, that they're in a position of strength versus your weakening position? And again, any ideas? If you're Johnson, how do you convince them? Misinformation. Okay, that could come back to bite you, though, right? Misinformation. Because after all, the writing's on the wall, right? You just go out with guns blazing, right? Sir, you said, such as? Yeah, maybe one of the Warsaw Pact powers or something. Maybe Yugoslavia, who's officially neutral but has some leanings at least towards both the East and the West. The problem is that because the Johnson administration is really on the way out, the Soviet Union just drags its feet. And after all, strategically, I think it's a sound move in the fact that they're really in a position of strength. They are gaining economic power. They are gaining military power, both conventionally and strategically. So there's no reason for them to actually negotiate with the United States in this period of kind of easing off tensions because things are going their way. They seem to be winning the Cold War all of a sudden, and why negotiate with a loser? Now, the gentleman in the front said negotiate with a competitor. So the Détente process actually starts under the Johnson administration, but it's also going through Europe as well. Willy Brandt, who's the Chancellor of Germany, West Germany, by the way, is a rabid anti-communist, by the way, rabid anti-Nazi as well. He lived through the Nazi issues, World War II. And he actually starts this idea that in Germany proper, that the East and West Germany should actually be closer together, both economically and maybe politically as well. That there shouldn't, despite the fact that there's a big wall between them, that maybe they should have some common connections. And he goes one step further and recommends that not only should West Germany have closer connections with East Germany, but they also should have closer connections with Poland and the Soviet Union. So I would argue that you have this massive détente structure between the Soviet Union and the United States happening and being pushed from the Johnson administration. But by the time you reach 1968-69, you have Willy Brandt who's pushing what he calls Ostpolitik, or Eastern policy, which he's starting to look east and start to recognize that with the European being solidified as far as spheres of influence, that now the East and West can start to bury some of the issues of post-World War II and start to negotiate as peer competitors. Sounds like a good plan, right? Okay. So he's going to go do this. And he's going to talk to Warsaw, he's going to talk to Soviet Union and Yugoslavia as well. But he has really two major elements that come out of this. You have the August Agreement of 1970 with the Soviet Union, which is a non-aggression pact, which is pretty significant. There's an earlier non-aggression pact. Anybody remember that? Kind of World War II-ish, right? Yeah, a Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. Well, what Brandt's going to recommend is that the Soviet Union and West Germany recognize that it's in no one's best interest to use force. So this agreement that both the Soviet Union and Brezhnev signs with Willy Brandt is that they agree not to use force against one another. Now, this is pretty significant. This is 1970, and if you look at Warsaw Pact war plans, guess where the fighting is going to come from? The East, right? But it's not going to be the Soviet Union, it's going to be Warsaw Pact members. which is kind of one of those diplomatic wrinkles, right? We're not going to attack you. We're going to let the Poles do it for us. We're going to let the Hungarians do it for us. But it's at least a recognition that there is some common ground in this Cold War that nations can recognize force may not be the best answer. And after all, if you're Germany, you're on the front lines of the Cold War, as you'll hear next month with the Yom Kippur War and then U.S. doctrine, okay? But Brandt starts to break this ground. And there's one other significant agreement that comes months after this agreement with the Soviet Union, and that's in December 1970, which is agreement with Poland. And this is significant because if you don't know your kind of German history, there's actually border disputes going on since the end of World War II between Germany and Poland. And Willy Brandt's going to go to Poland, Warsaw specifically, and recommend they settle the border dispute, and then they start to open up as far as relationships between the two countries, politically, economically, agriculturally, and then also diplomatically. But the pictures you see at the bottom, I want to talk about this first because this has a profound impact, is that when Brandt, who goes to Warsaw, and as I said, he's a rabid anti-Nazi, he ceremoniously kneels down at the Ghetto Memorial, which is the middle picture, which is the memorial to those Poles, Jewish Poles that fought against Nazi and Soviet oppression. And this is a big moment. He kneels down and takes a moment of silence, not planned, by the way, completely on his own accord. And this picture is kind of flashed around the globe. You end up with a memorial plaque, which is in Warsaw, actually a park across the street from where the Ghetto Memorial is. And it demonstrates that the Poles have some kind of profound, this has a profound impact on the Poles. This is a man who cares about history and wants to see the legacy of evil kind of buried in a new era of détente worked out. So this is pretty significant that you have a West German chancellor doing this. So if a West German chancellor can do this, so can the United States, right? No? You guys aren't going to be, come on, pep up, right? This agreement with Poland, one of the significant issues is that it does finally settle the border dispute. It actually recognizes Poland's western border as the Oder-Neser line, which actually cedes quite a bit of German territory to Poland. And Willy Brandt takes a huge political hit for what is seen as giving away a large chunk of Germany to the Poles. But he does this for a greater political motive, which is ultimately to open negotiations and diplomatic recognition with the Poles via West Germany. Okay? So again, the question becomes, if Willy Brandt's pushing this, one of our allies on the front line, can the United States now start to open negotiations with the Soviet Union? And the answer is going to be yes, but Johnson can't do it. It's going to have to be Nixon and Kissinger. Okay? Any questions on Ostpolitik? As the Johnson administration segues to the Nixon administration. Nixon and Henry Kissinger have some ideas about how they need to change the balance of the United States. And essentially, here are the 6 points that they have. They want to readjust U.S. foreign policy. They believe that the foreign policy under the Johnson administration was dangerous. It put the United States in a weak position, and therefore we have to essentially climb out of a hole. And the hole is really one of political recognition and ultimately militarily, meaning strategic weapons as well. Okay? They also believe, and this may sound counterintuitive, though they believe that there's a need for cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States, as well as China, by the way. So it's really 3 parts here. All right? And they believe that the United States and the Soviet Union, although we're engaged in this ideological Cold War, that there are common grounds that we have. One of them, as Willy Brandt pointed out, is probably the fact that we don't want to see another war happen. Because if another war is going to happen, it's going to be a nasty business with tactical nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, and lots of smoking dead people, by the way. Which follows from the third point. The third point is, if we seek cooperation, if we recognize points that we can both get along on, possibly economic, humanitarian, diplomatic, strategic arms control, that we can actually reduce the tension in the Cold War. And if we reduce the tension in the Cold War, the likelihood that there will be a shooting war should diminish. Now, decent goal, again. Now, the problem is that how do you do this when Brezhnev there on the bottom is openly advocating supporting revolutions around the globe. How do you convince him that it's in his best interest to kind of back off supporting revolutions when that is one of the stated missions of Marxist-Leninism, and it's in his much bigger interest, strategic interest, to enter in negotiations with you and your NATO allies? And again, that's one of the major problems, one of the major questions the Nixon administration has, is how do you convince them to do this? And we'll talk about that in a few seconds here. But again, this idea of balancing balanced power and reestablishing equality is the part where Henry Kissinger comes into play. Henry Kissinger is a big fan of kind of power politics, balance of power, and he sees that the Soviet Union from about 1966 on seems to be gaining a much stronger hand. And if you know anything about Soviet economics, from about 1965 on actually to about 1970, they're doing pretty well economically. As the United States is starting to hit a few recessional humps along the way, and we're going to end up with an oil embargo by 1973 and some other issues. In contrast to the Soviet Union, they're doing quite well economically. Now, granted, it's a central planned economy, and you can manufacture and fabricate numbers to make things look much better than they are, but economically on the world stage, they seem to be doing a pretty damn good job. Kissinger's going to recommend that, okay, we need to engage them economically. They're going to have some long-term agricultural problems. The U.S. can help because we're going to start having surpluses of wheat and other issues that we can start sending to them. So he starts to recognize that we can start to correct this balance, not only in military, which I'll talk about in a second, but also agriculturally, economically. That there's benefits for both of us. We can get money and export grain. Soviet Union will therefore get food, and we'll start to kind of reduce this tension. Now, the other issue that Kissinger brings up to Nixon is the fact that it's not just about wheatstuffs and foodstuffs, it's also about strategic nuclear weapons. Well, the Soviet Union may be getting stronger economically. Strategically, their numbers of nuclear weapons are growing, but the United States still has at least numerical superiority. We're going to have about 13,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviets around this time have about 12,000 nuclear warheads. And Kissinger's going to argue we can use that as leverage, that we still retain mastery of strategic nuclear weapons. So therefore, you should negotiate with us because we have the power to do lots of things that we want to do. But again, is that a real threat, or is that a credible threat, I should ask, versus a real threat?
12,000 virus, or 13,000 virus is not going to cover near the percentage of their territory, but their 12,000 virus.
It'll cover, and it's enough to about quadruple their target sets that we need to cover, just in case. And then maybe a few left over to bust a few cities if we need to. So it's enough to do what we need to do. So there is a position, there is a strategic lever here that you can use in pride. Because you can argue that the Soviet Union, listen, we're only going to build more. You can build more, but in reality, ours are technologically better than yours. They're bigger than yours as far as yield-wise and technologically more advanced. And we have more of them. So if you want to continue down this road, we'll just continue this and the gap can expand out. Or we can negotiate and kind of come to an agreement where we both agree that X number are enough and we can start to reduce that tension. Because after all, the idea is that after Vietnam, that after 1968, where the tension is relatively high between the superpowers, that we can start to suppress this because no one wants to see the tension get too high to the point where, the cork blows. If the cork blows, it's bad news for everybody. And this is where I think Kissinger sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap in the fact that he's seen as kind of a power-hungry political broker. He's in tune with the fact that the shooting war in Vietnam has a profound impact on the strategic balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. That if you can reduce the tension that's kind of ratcheting up from 1968, you can start to back off and recognize that everybody's going to be cool, no shooting wars, everyone relax. And this is the significance of Willy Brandt and his Ostpolitik. If he can have a negotiation with the Soviet Union and recognize that non-aggression pacts can be signed between West Germany and the Soviet Union, surely the United States and the Soviet Union, the two big superpowers, can come to an agreement on reducing tensions among the two. Okay? A more sinister point here. Maybe sinister is the wrong word, but after all, we're talking Nixon, right? I think Oliver Stone would agree with me, but I'm not a big fan. Nixon also sees détente as an opportunity to exploit the Sino-Soviet split. That there's a divergence in the relationship between the Maoist in China and Brezhnev and his Marxist-Leninist ideas. And if we can split this world communist alliance into two, we can have diplomatic negotiations with the Chinese, which will ultimately help in Vietnam. We can also start to use negotiation with the Soviet Union and therefore keep these two apart so you don't have a monolithic communist movement anymore, which is significant. But again, tough nut to crack. Now, part of the problem is that split has already happened. There's no great love between the Chinese and the Soviets after all. So a lot's made about Nixon exploiting this rift, but the rift is already there and the rift is already growing apart. He just uses it and uses it to his best advantage. I would argue he uses it specifically to help do what he needs to do, essentially try to end the war in Vietnam, because he's not worried about Chinese involvement and or Soviet involvement because he's actively engaging both of them in negotiations at the time. Okay. The last point here is the reality is the 70s. Economic issues are going to become a problem as economies start to tank around 71, 72. Strategic nuclear balance is an issue with everybody. And the idea that how do you come out of Vietnam and reprogram military societies after 10, 15 years of war, which is pretty significant. So the realities of the 70s actually come home to Nixon as well. He's going to have to do some things diplomatically at the international level, but he also has significant domestic problems that he has to deal with. And he sees Détente as, in one small way, helping this out. And I'll talk about agriculture here in a few seconds because that's one of his ways to help alleviate some of the economic crisis. Okay? But this is really the strategic background that goes into Nixon and Kissinger talking about and wanting to push détente. And all détente means is really a relaxing of tensions. The Soviet Union, they tend to use a different word, which is interesting. They tend to use peaceful coexistence, which sounds the same, right? Peaceful coexistence, relaxation of tensions. We're both getting along, right? But in Marxist-Leninist paradigms, peaceful coexistence just means you and I recognize that we each exist, but I'm fomenting the revolution and moving on with a proper relationship, which is ultimately seeing your demise. So what you'll see is, you'll see, if you read the literature at the time, you'll see the Soviet writers talking about peaceful coexistence, the Americans and the Westerns talking about détente, and they're not the same thing by any stretch of the imagination. Peaceful coexistence is actually, we're going to continue with our policies of the Brezhnev Doctrine, we're going to continue with our policies of advocating revolution, we're going to continue with our policies of seeing the overthrow and downfall of Western democracy. Now, do you really want to do business with these people? No, you don't want to, but you kind of have to, right? They are the bigger kid on the block, and you're going to have to deal with them, okay? So again, the language of the period is interesting. So when you go back and read things, be mindful of the way the Marxists use language, because peaceful coexistence is not the same thing as détente or mutual relationships. It really is a pointed idea about a proper relationship, which is really Soviet advantage over U.S. advantage, okay? So the process starts, and it starts through just open negotiations, the leaders talking to one another. And if you read the historic literature, it's problematic. Depends what partisan side you're on. You either love détente or you hate détente. If you're folks like Raymond Garthoff, who are more on the Democratic wing of the foreign policy side, you hate détente, or I'm sorry, you kind of like détente. If you're on the Republican side, the folks that will be affiliated with like Ronald Reagan, those characters, you absolutely hate détente. And I'll come to talk about this because it really does have positive and negative effects. And depending on what political azimuth you're looking at it from, one of these effects, positive or negative, seem much stronger than the other, all right? The positive effects is really going to boost U.S. economic policy, and the fact that I have the second point, which is really agriculture. Détente allows Nixon to negotiate agricultural agreements with the Soviet Union that allows U.S. farmers to export grain, i.e. wheat mainly, to the Soviet Union. Now, if you're a farmer here in Kansas, is that good news or bad news? Good news. It's fantastic news. If you're a Soviet and now you can get grain, good news or bad news? Good. You can eat, right? Hungry people tend to, throw off revolutions and kill people, right? So good. Keep them content and happy. So the détente has this odd economic and political effect for both. It also has a humanitarian effect. It starts to focus some of the discussion on Russian Jews, which are coming from folks like Henry Jackson from Washington, Scoop Jackson, who one of his primary focuses is how the Soviet Union treats its Jewish immigrants, how it treats its domestic Jews in the Soviet Union, which is reprehensible. So it starts this idea, and this is going to come really, the epitome of this is going to really come out later in the Ford administration, but Nixon and Kissinger start the ball rolling in the fact that if you want to be perceived as a near competitor, as a co-equal partner in this world stage, you start treating people a little better. You shouldn't deny people leaving because of religious affiliation. You shouldn't roll tanks into Prague or Budapest to suppress student rebellion, which tends to be the Soviet method of crowd control. Okay? I would argue those are the positive effects. So the problem is these are going to take a while to kind of come to fruition. I would argue that most of these really don't come to fruition and are seen as strong effects until really the middle to late Carter administration. So if you're looking at Détente from a Republican perspective, capital R Republican, they're weak, right? You're not going to see the benefit of these for a good 6 years. Problematic, right? Which is where you get the negative effects. And the negative effects really focus on two specific points: perceptions of strength and then strategic arms. And these are going to start coming from folks like Paul Nitze, Bill Van Cleve, Richard Pearl, a guy by the name of Don Rumsfeld, maybe you've heard of him. These guys would become the neoconservatives, and they make the argument that Détente has fundamentally weakened the United States. It has allowed the Soviet to gain strategic superiority numerically, and we'll talk about why that's important when I talk about arms control here in a few seconds. They've allowed the Soviet Union to expand across the globe, Latin America and Africa. And the United States is in a much weaker position strategically than it ever was in 1968. And to a certain point, if you look at the map and what's going on in the 70s, there's something to be said for that. The related point to that is strategic arms. One of the accusations that's leveled against Nixon and Kissinger is that they have allowed the Soviet Union to achieve strategic superiority numerically. That if you look at the numbers, the Soviet Union is going to build up warheads about essentially equivalent just above what the United States has between the 71 to 73. So remember when I talked about those 13,000 warheads we have, we're going to stay at about 13 now until about the mid-80s, by the way, and the Soviet Union is going to climb to about the same with just a few more than us. So again, if you're looking at it from the strategic perspective, is the United States stronger than it was in 1968 or weaker militarily? And after all, we're recovering from Vietnam too, by the way, which has a profound impact on the military. We look much weaker. So depending on which partisan side you're from, Détente has either a really kind of strong positive effects, which seem to be focused on more domestic-based issues or humanitarian issues. At the strategic level, it's an abject failure. Now, Détente's going to stay around until about 1979, and what puts the death nail in Détente as a diplomatic negotiation process really is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which finally demonstrates that the Soviets aren't backing off of pushing worldwide revolution. In fact, they're going to go into Afghanistan, take out a president, install their own regime, and then fight an 11-year war against Mujahideen. Okay? That's what I want to do with the Détente, but now I want to do you understand the strategic context on which this is happening and the effect that it has? Lots and lots of ink has been spilled on trying to assess Détente in the historical context. And to boil it down simply for you, it's either positive or negative. So now you don't have to read all those books that are too thick. And it's really complicated. They get into all these kind of crazy issues, and they being the primary actors who were there at the time, whether they're on the Democratic side, capital D Democrat, or Republican side. They argue these effects. But it can be noted that the negative effects, perceptions of strength, which are important in the Cold War, the United States does seem to be at a much lower position than it was prior to 1968. When we're reaching 1970, 1973, there seems to be a general malaise happening. We seem to have lost some of our foreign policy credibility. We seem to have lost some of our strategic panache. We seem to have lost some of our swagger. Okay? Questions on Détente as a diplomatic process and as an idea on how to move the United States forward. Does it achieve its objectives? Largely no. It relaxes tensions, sort of. But there's always an inherent distrust between Brezhnev, Nixon, then Brezhnev and Ford, and then Brezhnev and Carter, and then Brezhnev and Reagan, and then Andropov, Chernenko, and then we get to Gorbachev, which is a completely different thing altogether. Mike?
The Nixon's trip to China in 1972, did that aggravate the process, or did that alleviate the aggression?
It aggravates the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. It alleviates the tension between the United States and China. But again, if you're trying to convince the Soviet Union that it's in their best interest to negotiate with you and come to terms with you,
They did view that in a negative light.
they did. But again, by '72, they really need the wheat that we have, the excess wheat, the surplus wheat. So you can use that leverage to say, hey, I'm meeting with Mao for other issues, cultural issues, stuff like that. You guys need something, we have it. So you start using those other elements, those soft power elements, to kind of negotiate with them as well. Okay?
What point did the Soviet Union start their massive buildup of their conventional forces?
When did they start that? About 1946.
Because I know by the end of the 70s, there was a ridiculous number of tanks.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about arms control here in a second, strategically, but conventionally, the numbers are problematic because it depends whether you're counting Warsaw Pact forces in that, and they go up and down. And one of the problems that you have with the Soviet Union is no one's really ever sure how much they actually produce. Even they don't, because their records are kind of specious at best. And we think we made 5,000, when in reality they probably made 7,000, but only like 2,000 work. So there's problems with Soviet economics and Soviet math, all right? Okay? What I want to spend a few minutes talking about is really the strategic arms limitation talk, which is really what Détente is centered around. It's the idea that if you really want to reduce tensions in the international community, what we need to do is really focus on the specter of nuclear war. And the things that represent the specter of nuclear war more than anything else are strategic nuclear weapons. So the idea is that can we engage the Soviet Union in a real arms control process whereby we either limit and or freeze the level of strategic nuclear weapons. And again, by this time, we're looking at about 13,000 warheads on each side. Now, this is where words become really important, because warhead is just the actual physical warhead on the missile, and that's what they're going to start focusing on a little later. But they're talking about delivery vehicles, which are missiles, bombers, essentially, and then carriers, which are things like submarines, bombers, and missiles as well. Okay? So Nixon and Kissinger believed that really the best way to engage the Soviet Union is arms control. And arms control is the primary way that you can correct that balance, the strategic balance we talked about, reestablish U.S. foreign policy, and also reduce the threat of nuclear war. And the idea is that between 1969 and 1972, as I mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union seems to have built more weapons and are gaining a strategic lead in ICBMs specifically. Now, we still have a lead in bombers, by the way, which are just a vehicle to carry weapons, and we also have a lead in submarines that can launch ballistic missiles, as well as those missiles that can be launched from submarines, which are pretty important. Now, the big threat from the Nixon administration, though, is that the Soviet Union, see that big missile lying on the ground right there, being paraded through the streets of Moscow? That's an SS-9 by NATO code name. It's like an R-36 from the Soviet side. And it's going to have anywhere from about a 1 megaton to about a 10 megaton warhead, which is pretty huge. Hiroshima is about 14 kiloton, by the way, so this is magnitudes more. And it's what's known as a heavy ICBM, meaning that that little Minuteman that you see on the other side, which is the U.S. primary missile deployed in 66, 67, has a warhead of about 140 to about 500 kiloton. That's kind of a standard ICBM. So this R-36, this SS-9, kind of sends a shockwave through the U.S. and NATO in the fact that the Soviets, they may be behind in ICBMs, but they're starting to build these things called heavy ICBMs that can be really useful in taking out U.S. ICBM silos and U.S. bomber bases. So if you're a planner, do you want to get rid of those, or do you want the Soviet Union to continue building more of those? Yeah, they're definitely a threat, okay? And this is going to start driving that strategic matrix that they're going to start focusing on. The second point is that the Soviet Union now has numerical superiority, which means they're going to have more nuclear weapons than us. Now, what's significant here is that if you look at that last bullet, we haven't deployed a brand new missile since 1967, which is that Minuteman, which is state-of-the-art. And in that middle picture you see there, that thing that looks like a little podium with 3 little cones on it, the little podium thing is called a bus. That's what separates from the missile and carries the warheads through space. And then those cones are actually warheads. Those are things that are going to separate, and they're going to go to 3 separate targets. That's what's known as a MIRV, Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicle. So while the Soviet Union may have more ICBMs, our missiles have 3 warheads per missile. We're starting to work on this, actually. It's starting to be deployed through the force, and we're going to start working on warheads that have, or missiles that have anywhere from 3 to 10 eventually warheads. So again, you can argue the Soviet Union, you may have more, you may have big ones, but each one of our missiles carry 3 warheads, and this gives you some strategic leverage and flexibility now. That one missile isn't just for one target. One missile now can take out 3 targets, which is pretty significant. So it does give the Soviet Union some idea that, okay, they have a capability that we don't have yet. They're working on it, but they don't have it yet because it's technologically pretty advanced to do what you need to do in those little cones, those warheads. And it gives some leverage to the fact that we should start engaging in strategic arms limitation talks, or SALT. Okay? SALT's going to begin in November 1969, and it's a long, slow process. It's not going to be completed until, as you see, May of 1972, and it won't be, it's problematic here. There's actually no SALT agreement ever reached. You have an ABM treaty that I'll talk about, which is reached, and then you have an interim agreement between the two sides, which is reached. But as far as an actual arms limitation agreement on containing nuclear weapons, one is never reached, okay? And the purpose is right there, right? Limit the number of strategic delivery vehicles. What's the problem you see with that purpose statement? Pardon me? Verification is a huge issue. They're going to build that into the interim agreement that we have to be able to, you have to let us come look to make sure you're either destroying these or building what you say you're building, not just doing whatever you want. The problem is delivery vehicle. If the real problem is a warhead, why focus on a delivery vehicle? Delivery vehicle is just a bomber, it's a submarine, or it's the actual missile. It does nothing about warheads. That's one of the problems that we're going to run into with SALT, and why there's going to be a SALT 2 a little later, in the fact that this first attempt seems to have some problems in the fact that it's not focusing on suppressing the number of warheads. It's just about, let's start engaging in a conversation, and the thing that we can agree on really is just delivery vehicles, because it is problematic to start talking about warheads at this point, because no one wants to give up warheads, especially if you're in the driver's seat and starting to achieve superiority. Okay? Now, why would you want to engage in this? And there's U.S. advantages and Soviet advantages I talked about. U.S. advantage, as I mentioned, are MIRV warheads. We are starting to build ICBMs that have 3 warheads per missile, and we're going to work towards anywhere between 8 to 10 warheads per missile. Soviet Union advantage really is in ICBMs and the fact that they can build these big, heavy ICBMs. So there's an offset here. And when you're talking about nuclear strategy, you have bombers, missiles, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and they all have specific qualities and defense things that are significant. So there's a blend of this triad. Each one has specific advantages and disadvantages. So you're both coming into this negotiation with strengths and weaknesses, and both recognize that. Okay? Here are the limitations. Here is the actual kind of elements of the agreement that emerges out of this. They both agree that this agreement, this interim agreement, is a 5-year duration, which means if you sign it in October 72, it's only good through October 1977. You wouldn't want to lock yourself into something of unlimited duration, right? Who knows what may happen. So they agree that it's going to be a 5-year duration. It's going to ban the construction of those heavy ICBMs. Remember those R-36s or those SS-9s or those big warheads? The United States is going to hold fast that you have to get rid of those. And the Soviet Union is going to come back and say, but wait a minute, those really offset your advantage in submarine-launched ballistic missiles as well as MIRV warheads, so we need to retain them. The United States comes back and says, okay, because after all this is a negotiation, right? You have to come back with a counter to the counter. And the counter to the counter is, okay, you can't build any more heavy ICBMs. So whatever you have in place, you can continue. Whatever you're building right now, you can maintain, but you can't build anything new after a specific date. And this is where a lot of those hawks, those neoconservative hawks, start to look at and say, hey, you guys missed a big opportunity here. You're actually letting the Soviet Union build something that is strategically disadvantageous to us. And what do we get out of it? We don't get much out of it besides a significant threat. And we get to keep our MIRVs, by the way, which is a big sticking point for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wants to get us to get rid of MIRVs, one missile, one warhead. And we say, well, if you get to keep your heavy ICBM, we get to keep MIRVs. And MIRVs are quickly pulled off the table then as a negotiating agreement. It's going to ban the construction of brand new SLBM launchers. Submarine launched ballistic missile is SLBM, which is really, you're going to ban the construction of brand new submarines. The recognition from the Soviet perspective is the United States has something like 710 submarine launched ballistic missiles, and they have about 66 submarines, which is pretty significant. That's quite a lot. This is the Poseidon system, and we're working towards the Trident C4 system, which are just upgraded versions of submarine launched ballistic missiles. And the significance of submarine-launched ballistic missiles is that it gives you a second secure deterrent effect. That missile bases and bomber bases are easily seen from spy satellites. Once you send a submarine out into the ocean, it's very, very hard to detect. So it provides you with a secure second strike capability. So this is why the Soviet Union is really concerned about this, because it provides the United States with a very specific ability to strike the Soviet Union if they strike us first. The other issue they're starting to have is that as we build new generations of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, they're getting better and better to the point where they're more accurate. The first ones are nothing more than kind of nuclear confetti. They can kind of come within about 100-mile range, but as technology advances, as satellite navigation gets better, those submarines can actually get better fixes and provide better guidance packages to submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and they can get more accurate to the point where by the 1980s, the Trident D5 submarine-launched ballistic missile is going to be even more precise and accurate than a land-based missile, which is significant. So that threatens the Soviet Union. So they say, okay, you can't build any more of those. And what they're going to argue, and this is the one agreement they're going to actually come to, is the agreement on limiting the numbers of submarine-launched ballistic launchers, which merely means submarines, okay? The U.S. can deploy 710 launchers, which allows them to build up from 656. So they have 656 when they sign in 72, and they can now build up to 710, which is pretty significant. That maintains an advantage for us. Now, the Soviet Union number, right? Look at that. They have 740 deployed, and they're allowed to build up to 950. Does this make any sense to anybody in the room? It doesn't make sense to you or no? No, this is a negotiation, right? This is a game of poker. Well, no. The Cold War's over. We don't need to worry about this anymore.
Was this a counterbalance to the MIRV technology that we had to give them also?
Absolutely. To get them to stop harping on MIRV, you say, okay, you guys can have SLBMs. You can build up to a level that is essentially greater than ours, which is significant. So yeah, again, strategic nuclear balance is a delicate thing, and each one has an advantage and a weakness. The Soviets perceive MIRV as a significant weakness, therefore they can build up their SLBM fleet. Because one of the strengths of the Soviet Union really is rocket technology, and they actually end up with really good ICBMs and really good SLBMs. So this allows them to at least feel safer now, and they can start building up a secure second strike capability as well. Okay? Well, that's a good point, but you need to look at this in a very mathematical sort of way, which is what the strategic planners do. This is about assigning weapons to targets and trying to achieve an effect. And you have to essentially, and this may sound weird and kind of Dr. Strangelove-like, but you have to, emotion doesn't play a role here. This is all cold calculus. You need 13,000 because there are 13,000 targets that you need to assign a weapon to. And it may seem like overkill, and emotionally it's problematic, but in the strategic calculation, it's just what you need to do.
I have a serious question. I don't mean to derail this conversation, but I read once that the People's Republic of China were like really suspicious that the United States got the Russians into this Cold War, this armed escalation, just as a deception to for the downfall, like that the Russian collapsed because
No.
cold and calculated
No.
arms race that really wasn't true, that they believed it to be true.
No.
So that's like, I mean, it's just
I'll say it one more time. No.
okay. Let's just
We can talk later, but
So you disagree with the People's Republic of China, is that what you're saying?
the Cold War was not started with this grandiose plan that in 50 years we're going to bankrupt the Soviet Union and break up. No. Okay. All right, ICBM is the other point. The strength of the United States coming into SALT negotiations is our ICBM fleet, which we have. We have about a 1054, which is significant. This is huge, but we have a lot of old systems. And the idea here that if you're going to build new, you have to get rid of the old, which in some ways is good because you can have improved technology. They can be more accurate, more precise, but you're not going to have as many of them. But if you're putting MIRVs on them, who cares, right? You can put 10 on the MX. All right, fantastic. Actually, I think it's 8. 10's on the Trident. So there's this game going on that as you're trying to reduce tension, neither side wants to relinquish strategic initiative or strategic plan. So you start to figure out, okay, how can I game the system? If you only let me have 1054, I can actually put 8 warheads on each one, so that gives me another 8,000. Fantastic. So this attempt to achieve arms control, real arms control, is essentially kind of lost in the balance. And what you can see is the Soviet Union ends up with 1618 with more under construction. And the idea, again, is you can't build anything new, but whatever's in the pipeline, you can finish. So the Soviets, who are fantastic at this, can say, okay, well, we have another 1,600 in the pipeline, no problem. And you can't build any new silos, so whatever's there is there. And this is going to get re-raised again, really, in the end of the Carter administration. If you guys remember the MX Peacekeeper missile and the huge fight in the late 70s, early 80s over how you want to deploy it. It comes back to SALT II, actually, and then ultimately is going to figure into SALT, where there are significant agreements that you don't want to violate on how you're going to deploy it, whether it's going to be in a missile or a silo in the ground, or whether it's going to be in a mobile launcher. There's all kinds of issues that come into play that come back to kind of hamper our strategic deployment. Sir?
Point of clarification. Does this allow for replacement
Yes.
of existing missiles with a more advanced system, whether it's the warhead delivery system or whatever?
Yes, you can replace, if you get rid of old, you can replace with new. It's going to put what they call ceilings. The ceiling of your ICBMs is going to be 1054. You can't go above that. If you're going to go above that, you better get rid of something so you remain at that level. So it allows you to build new ones. And again, I'll talk quickly about SALT II, which is a real mess. But again, this is, I would argue that as an arms control agreement, this is an abject failure. But it's a start. You're at least talking about something. And what we learn as we go through SALT II, strategic arms reduction talks start under Reagan administration 1 and then start 2, which kind of straddles the Bush-Clinton administration. You start getting better and better at it. We start focusing on actual warheads and reducing the total number. Okay? But as a strategic concept, SALT is an abject failure. But at least it's a start. No pun intended, by the way. Now, I'll talk about this one real quickly because this is the final agreement that comes out of the SALT talks, and this is the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This is the one hardcore arms control agreement that is actually signed by both the United States and the Soviet Union and says, okay, we will limit ourselves to 2 anti-ballistic missile sites. And they agree with this. And if you remember back during the Bush administration, there was a big debate about missile defense. In fact, it's still going on. But one of the big issues was that the Bush administration, this is George W. Bush, abrogated our U.S. commitment to the ABM Treaty, which says we're no longer party to that, which allows you to do some things that, you weren't allowed to do during this. And again, based upon that strategic balance, the idea that you can build a ballistic missile defense system is seen as inherently destabilizing. Because if you have an advantage in ICBMs and I can build a defense against them, who's safer now, me or you? Me. So both sides recognize that there's an inherent problem here if we're going to reduce tensions and if you're going to have lots and lots of missile defense systems. So the ABM treaty comes out, and here it is. Both sides have the capability by the time we reach 1970. The United States has a deployed system called Safeguard with Sprint and Sentinel. Sentinel is a radar system, so you may hear these terms. You may hear Safeguard, which is the overall program. Sentinel is the ballistic missile radar, the phased array radar. The Sprint is actually the bottom interceptor. The top one is the Soviet Kalic system, which is really an upgraded surface-to-air missile that they actually use around Moscow, and then you're allowed to put them also around ICBM sites. So the agreement's going to come out and say, okay, here are the rules for ABM. Each nation can have 2 sites, which means you can have 2 deployment areas, one around your capital and one around an ICBM field. And if you know it or not, we're kind of in the middle of a big ICBM field here in the Midwest. So it was going to be up in, actually it was up in South Dakota. It was a Sentinel. Sentinel radar was there, and there was going to be a safeguard base built there too. We had one that was around for about 1.5 years, and then we get rid of it. But you're allowed to do this, all right? And it's a question about stability, that if you do this, you both have some degree of defensive capability, limited, so you don't abrogate strategic advantage in one side or the other, so you have kind of essential equivalence in defense capabilities and offensive capabilities as well. And if you look at the points of the ABM Treaty, you know, you can't have more than 100 launchers, so they limit it as far as numbers, so you can only have 100 actual physical launchers and missiles. So 100, that's it. You can't go 101, you can't go 102. If you want to go below that, great, but it caps it significantly at 100. You can only have 2 phased array radars, and these are big, powerful radars that can actually look north and scan the sky for incoming ICBMs, because the idea is if you have more than that, you can actually have an advantage in taking out and vectoring your sprint missiles in on an incoming ICBM. And the last point is that they must be land-based. The idea that neither side want, and this is really more the United States talking to the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union has a pretty significant advantage in surface-to-air missiles and missile systems, and they're very good at deploying and developing mobile-based ICBMs. And they're worried that the Soviet Union can actually take that technology and use it for ballistic missile defense and deploy it on submarines, on road mobile vehicles that actually provide a hidden system. So they argue that you can't, it must be land-based, it must be fixed to territory. So the Soviet Union builds one around Moscow, and one around their central ICBM fields, and we're going to build one up in South Dakota and then quickly get rid of it later for reasons because we think it's destabilizing. But the ABM Treaty has actually a significant half-life in the fact that it is, I would argue, a relatively positive element of the SALT negotiations, and the fact that it at least gets to limiting some weapon systems and the idea that you can deploy a defensive system, but it's very limited because you want to maintain that strategic balance as well.
Why would we give up the advantage that we have more aircraft carriers, more submarines, and agree that it would only be land-based?
Because you can't an ABM site, what you have are the 2 huge radars, which a phased array radar, like a Sentinel, is probably about the size of this building, by the way. So it's really hard to put that on an aircraft carrier or even a road mobile system. What you can really deploy on those are the missiles, but the problem is they have to be within a limited capability of that radar because you need connectivity between the radar and then the launcher. And in between that, you also have smaller radars that can scan the sky in different azimuths and stuff in different power. So you're really not giving that up. It's really a physics problem, the fact that the need for a powerful phased array radar, which gives you the proper information and enough timing, is so big and so powerful that it has to be land-based.
Haven't we unilaterally proposed building ballistic missile sites along the Soviet border in Poland and other places?
Those aren't sites, those are just radars. Yeah. Which is why we get out of this. We abrogated our commitment to this treaty under the Bush administration because it allows you to deploy those radars now. And the idea is you're not deploying them on the Soviet Union, you're actually deploying them where they're actually looking to see problematic states like North Korea, China, and Iran. Yeah, but the Soviets, right? And this is the legacy of that. The Soviet Union saying, no. This looks just like an ABM ring that you're ringing us with, and we don't like that. So again, there's a very, very long half-life of the ABM treaty, and it's under significant debate. Again, the problem becomes that the neoconservatives are going to argue that this is a horrible, horrible problem, and the fact that it negates our ability to produce strategic defense, which Reagan's going to come back in '83 and propose SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. And there's problems because we are signatories of the ABM treaty. But the treaty does say if at any point you want to leave the treaty, you have to formally submit why you want to leave the treaty and leave the treaty. But again, there is an element of at least balance within this, that both sides are kept at a significant point.
Have we really abrogated the treaty?
Yeah, we removed ourselves from the treaty.
We're
no longer signatories, correct. Now the Soviet Union along the way cheated the whole time. This is on record too. They actually continually improved the Kalic system around Moscow, and they actually, by the mid-'80s, have a very, very sound and very significant ballistic missile capability. and we don't. We actually scrap ours because we see it as inherently destabilizing, and instead we're going to build MX and Trident II SLBMs.
That was fairly easy to confuse and to deceive the inspector because they would move those things around constantly. And so you never really knew, is this missile
Right.
at this site?
Right, which is why they need to be land-based and fixed, because that's part of the issue, is that you play the shell game. No, we only have 5 missiles. When in reality, you have 50, but you're just...
I saw that over there last week.
Yeah, right, yeah, no.
Handles all of these treaties and often who's managing this history? It's the president sitting at his desk and conversing with the other defense, or is it like in the Pentagon or the State Department?
Both.
Is it just one?
There's a whole slew of interagency folks that negotiate. The president and his counterpart will come and sign it in November of '72. The negotiation, which takes place in the years from '68 to '72, is done by a whole staff of State Department folks, technical experts from the military, technical experts from academia, military representatives. So it's a huge gaggle of people. In fact, one of the professors I studied with at Missouri State, Bill Van Cleve, was on the first SALT negotiation team. And they're huge teams, and they come and go, and they're usually in nice spots like Vienna or Geneva, not so much Helsinki, but they tend to be in kind of posh diplomatic places because you're going to be spending lots of time there. It does have to be ratified by the Senate, right. Conclusions. Mixed results, as I mentioned. SALT seems to be an abject failure as a form of arms control. The ABM treaty, again, depending what partisan side you want, has either a positive element or a negative element. There are political elements from Détente, as I talked about with Willy Brandt, in negotiations with China and the Soviet Union. There is a general relaxation of tension, but the strategic specter of nuclear war still hangs over the two from, I would argue, the failed attempt from the SALT agreement. Okay? The problem becomes, and SALT's going to linger on through, as is Détente, through the Carter administration. And what really puts a death nail into Détente is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This is the final act that after years of, say, from 72 to 79, because remember the Soviets go into Afghanistan, December of 79, that we've put up with enough of the Soviet shenanigans. They're not being fair and honest. They're not being faithful to the spirit of Détente. So therefore, it's over. And with that, I will gladly take your questions.
Was there any particular time during the period of Détente where it seemed that the Soviet economy was not going to be able to support a large weapons program?
No, that really comes about after '83 with SDI, and the idea, and really it comes out much later after the Soviet Union crumbles, and the fact that if you're going to recommend the space-based laser technology to intercept ICBMs, that it does take a high technological capability that the Soviet Union doesn't necessarily seem to have. And part of the unintended consequences of SDI is that if you try to build that or overwhelm it with ICBMs and decoys and stuff, you're going to bankrupt your economy. But that wasn't the purpose of SDI. Unintended consequence. But during Détente, there was no recognition that they can't handle this economically. Sir?
Growing up in the 50s, it's always seemed to me that the threat that communism posed to the United States was exaggerated. And I can see why that would be the case. World War II, Korea wasn't that long ago. McCarthyism, they're godless. But, in the end, they only got one country in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba. We managed to contain that. A handful at most in Africa. 3 countries in Asia. And as a result of this huge famine and COVID, do you think it was really exaggerated? Without atomic weapons, it's a worry. I understand that.
No. I mean, because and I think you have to put yourself in the context of the people at the time. That if you come out of World War II and you see large swaths of Europe go red, if you see large swaths of Asia go red, if you see the way they intervene in Hungary and in Prague, If you see the way they're pushing buttons behind North Korea, Vietnam, both the Chinese and the Soviets, it's not exaggerated. For the leaders of the time, the threat is real. After all the ideological clash, you can't get over that. That Marxist-Leninism argues that the downfall of Western society tends to be capitalism. So you can't get over that rift. And the folks living in the period see it, feel it, it's real to them. Looking back now, we can say, oh yeah, it may have been overwhelmed, but in the period, I mean, it feels every bit real because every day you look at the map, it looks like something's turning red or something's turning blue, and that's problematic. Time for one more?
I remember President Carter talking about the abolition of missiles and stuff. I don't know if you're not really going as far as that, but you're talking a lot about Détente. I remember a word they used, malaise.
Yeah, that's a Carter term, right? General malaise, right?
So, I mean, does that have anything to do with the military aspect, or is that?
I would argue it's military, it's economic, it's domestic, it's everything. And it really is that post-Vietnam malaise. That you're coming out of Vietnam trying to figure out what's the proper course, how do we rebuild our military, how do we regain our international foreign policy credit, how do we maintain our strategic advantage. So I would argue from 73 to about, well, really, maybe 1991, that there is a coming back, a need to rebuild, which the Reagan administration is given lots of credit for kind of reestablish that credibility and getting over the malaise. But the malaise is generally associated with kind of the end of the Ford administration and really the Carter administration specifically. Okay. Thank you. It's my pleasure. I hope you got something out of it.